What if the people Prince Harry once called his purpose are now the ones demanding answers from him in court? Let that sit for a second, because this story doesn't begin with lawyers or lawsuits. It begins with wounded veterans, men and women who believed in a promise that said their sacrifice mattered, that their pain would not be paraded, packaged, and forgotten. And now, just months before the 2027 Invictus Games are set to return to the UK, that promise is being dragged into the harsh light of a courtroom. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the part no one expected. It isn't the press bringing this fight. It isn't royal insiders. It isn't critics or commentators. It's the veterans themselves. The very people the Invictus Games were created to serve are now accusing Prince Harry and Meghan Markle of something unthinkable. That money raised in the name of wounded heroes was mishandled, diverted, or used in ways that betrayed the mission they were promised. And before you decide what you believe, ask yourself this question. Why would veterans, many of whom avoided publicity for years, suddenly risk everything to go public now? The answer lies in timing, pressure, and a breaking point that's been building quietly behind closed doors. For years, the Invictus Games stood as Harry's moral shield, a symbol that insulated him from criticism. Whatever else people said about him, they couldn't touch Invictus. It was sacred ground, or so it seemed. But beneath the inspirational speeches, the glossy documentaries, and the red carpet charity appearances, something else was happening. Veterans were asking questions about budgets, about expenses, about decisions that didn't line up with the mission they were sold, questions that went unanswered, emails that went quiet, meetings that never happened. And slowly, the tone shifted, from confusion to frustration, from loyalty to doubt, from belief to betrayal. This lawsuit, according to those involved, isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. It's about money they say should have gone to rehabilitation, housing, mental health support, and athlete programs. Instead, they claim it vanished into a fog of administration, branding, and influence. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. If even part of these allegations is true, it raises a question no one wants to ask out loud. Was Invictus protecting veterans, or protecting Harry and Meghan? As the UK prepares to host the 2027 Games, veterans say they couldn't stay silent any longer, because allowing business as usual would mean being complicit in their own erasure. They didn't want a scandal. They wanted answers. But what they got instead pushed them toward the most drastic step imaginable: court. And what happened when they finally confronted the people at the top is where this story truly begins to unravel. Because according to multiple accounts, the response they received changed everything and set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. It started with a whisper, not a headline, not a scandal, a whisper between veterans who trusted each other more than they trusted the system. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't hear. Veterans don't complain easily. They're trained not to. They're conditioned to endure, to adapt, to push through discomfort and doubt. So when murmurs began circulating inside the Invictus community, they weren't dramatic. They were cautious, almost apologetic. Something feels off. That was the phrase, repeated quietly in group chats, in phone calls after events, in late-night conversations between people who had once believed Invictus saved their lives. At the beginning, everything looked right. The speeches were powerful. The crowds were supportive. The cameras loved the story of a prince who understood pain because he had worn a uniform himself. Many veterans said seeing Prince Harry on that stage made them feel seen for the first time since leaving service. But then came the details, the small things people usually ignore. Why was there suddenly less funding for athlete travel? Why were mental health programs quietly downsized? Why were some veterans told the budget just isn't there, while production costs around events seemed to grow? At first, they assumed miscommunication, or bureaucracy, or growing pains. Big organizations are messy, right? But the contradictions kept stacking up. Some veterans noticed that events looked bigger, flashier, more polished for cameras, yet support on the ground felt thinner. Others asked why consultants and external partners seemed to multiply while direct aid slowed down. And here's the part that cut the deepest. When veterans raised concerns, they weren't met with transparency. They were met with silence. Emails went unanswered. Requests for breakdowns were delayed. Meetings were postponed indefinitely. And slowly, The tone shifted from collaborative to distant. It felt less like a community and more like a brand. One veteran reportedly said something that spread quickly among the group. "We're starting to feel like props." That word landed hard. Props. Used for inspiration. Used for optics. Used to reinforce a narrative of compassion and leadership, while the people at the heart of the mission felt increasingly pushed to the margins. Ask yourself this. If Invictus was built for veterans, why did veterans feel afraid to ask where the money was going? That fear didn't come from nowhere. It came from power imbalance. From the knowledge that speaking out against a global figure like Prince Harry could mean being labeled ungrateful, bitter, or disloyal. And for a long time, that fear worked. Most stayed quiet. They told themselves it wasn't worth it, that the good outweighed the bad, that rocking the boat would only hurt future athletes. Until something changed. According to people close to the situation, a group of veterans attempted to resolve things privately. No media. No threats. Just direct questions and requests for clarity. They believed that once leadership understood how serious the concerns were, action would follow. Instead, what came back wasn't reassurance. It was distance. Suddenly, access tightened. Communication became filtered. And the message, whether spoken or implied, felt chillingly clear. This conversation was not welcome. That was the moment loyalty cracked. Because when an organization built on trust refuses transparency, people start to wonder what it's hiding. And that's when the whispers stopped being whispers. They became notes. They became timelines. They became conversations with lawyers. But the most shocking part? This was only the beginning. Because as veterans started comparing experiences, they realized something far more troubling. The issues weren't isolated. They were systemic. And once that realization hit, there was no going back. Because what they uncovered next didn't just suggest mismanagement. It suggested something much bigger and far more damaging was at play. Here's where the story flips on its head. Because the moment veterans stopped whispering and started comparing notes, the image of Prince Harry as untouchable hero began to crack. Ask yourself this. How does a man celebrated for serving veterans end up being named by veterans as part of the problem? The answer lies in roles that quietly expanded over time. At first, Harry was the face, the symbol, the founder whose presence opened doors and attracted donations. But slowly, according to those now involved in the lawsuit, influence turned into involvement. Decisions that once felt distant suddenly had fingerprints. Meetings weren't just ceremonial. Endorsements weren't just symbolic. And choices about money, partnerships, and priorities began tracing back to a much smaller circle at the top. Veterans say they noticed a shift when Invictus stopped feeling like a movement and started behaving like a managed enterprise. One that needed optics, storylines, global reach, and constant reinforcement of a personal brand. That's when Meghan Markle entered the picture more visibly. Publicly, she was presented as supportive, advocating, championing causes alongside her husband. But privately, veterans claim her presence coincided with a growing emphasis on image, media strategy, and narrative control. More cameras, more production, more attention on the Sussexes themselves. And here's the contradiction that shook people. As the spotlight grew brighter, support on the ground didn't. Veterans began asking why money was flowing into content creation, consulting fees, and strategic initiatives, while athlete resources faced quiet cuts. Why were some programs suddenly labeled unsustainable while branding efforts expanded? No one was accusing yet. They were still asking questions. But the answers never came. And then something critical happened. A small group of veterans decided to document everything. Dates, amounts, changes, promises made versus outcomes delivered. They weren't trying to destroy Invictus. They were trying to save it. That's when lawyers entered the conversation. Not aggressively, carefully, quietly. Exploring options. Understanding whether fiduciary responsibilities had been breached. Whether funds raised in the name of veterans were legally required to be used in specific ways. And this is where the tone shifted from concern to confrontation. Because once legal counsel reviewed the material, veterans were told something that stunned them. They might have a case, not a moral argument. A legal one. Refunds weren't mentioned casually. They were discussed as a corrective measure. A way to restore trust and ensure future funds, especially ahead of the 2027 UK Games, wouldn't be handled the same way. That's when the reality hit. Taking on Prince Harry wasn't just symbolic. It was dangerous. He wasn't just a founder. He was a global figure, a royal, a media powerhouse. And standing across from him in court meant stepping into a storm of scrutiny, doubt, and backlash. But veterans asked themselves a brutal question. If we don't speak now, when will we? Because silence would mean the system continues unchanged. Silence would mean future wounded athletes inherit the same problems. Silence would mean the mission they believed in becomes something they no longer recognize. And so the unthinkable happened. The prince who built Invictus as his legacy was no longer being praised for it. He was being challenged over it, named, questioned, and asked to account for decisions made under his watch. But just when it seemed like the lawsuit itself was the biggest shock, something else emerged behind the scenes. Something involving timing, jurisdiction, and the 2027 games that raised the stakes even higher. Because this legal fight wasn't just about the past. It was about stopping what veterans fear could happen next. And once that became clear, the pressure intensified in ways no one was prepared for. Here's the question that changed everything. Why now? Why didn't the veterans wait? Why didn't they stay quiet just a little longer, let the system run its course, and avoid the chaos that comes with taking on two of the most recognizable figures in the world? The answer is simple and terrifying. The moment the Invictus Games were officially slated to return to the UK, something snapped. For veterans, the UK isn't just another host country. It's symbolic. It's where the idea was born. It's where royal proximity amplifies credibility. And it's where scrutiny becomes unavoidable. Veterans began asking themselves a hard question. If the same leadership, the same structures, and the same lack of transparency remained in place, what exactly would change in 2027? Their fear wasn't hypothetical. Several veterans reportedly worried that the games would become even more polished on the surface, while the same unresolved issues continued underneath. Bigger audiences, bigger sponsors, bigger media moments. But still the same unanswered questions about how funds were handled and who was truly being prioritized. That's when the lawsuit stopped being about reimbursement alone. It became about prevention. Veterans didn't want to repeat. They didn't want another generation of wounded athletes discovering, years later, that the mission they trusted had quietly shifted away from them. They believed that allowing 2027 to move forward under the same leadership would legitimize everything they had been questioning. And here's the uncomfortable contradiction. Publicly, the narrative around Harry and Meghan remains one of compassion and advocacy. Carefully curated appearances, carefully worded statements, carefully protected imagery. Privately, veterans say they feel erased from that narrative. Ask yourself this. If a charity exists to serve veterans, why do veterans feel like the biggest obstacle to its image? That disconnect fueled anger. But more than anger, it fueled resolve. Legal advisors reportedly made one thing clear. Waiting until after 2027 would weaken their position. Acting now, before the games, was the only way to force accountability while it still mattered. And so the demand took shape. Refund the funds that were allegedly misused. Step away from influence over future games. Reset the structure before the UK hosts the world. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about control. Veterans wanted the mission back in their hands. But pushing for that kind of change comes at a cost. Some veterans feared backlash, loss of opportunities, being labeled troublemakers. Others worried the public would side with celebrity over testimony, that their service would be questioned while famous faces were defended. Still, they moved forward. Because for them, the risk of doing nothing felt worse. And here's the part no one is talking about yet. Behind the scenes, sponsors, organizers, and international partners are watching closely, quietly, carefully, because the outcome of this lawsuit doesn't just affect Harry and Meghan. It affects the future credibility of Invictus itself. If the court finds even partial fault, the ripple effects could be massive. Leadership changes, structural reforms, and questions about who should ever be allowed to control charities tied so closely to personal brands. But if the case fails, the message is just as powerful. That influence still outweighs accountability. And that's the moment we're approaching now. Because as 2027 looms closer, pressure is building on every side. On the veterans, on the organizers, and especially on Harry and Meghan. And according to sources close to the situation, Something is happening right now that could tip the balance entirely. Something that hasn't gone public yet. And when it does, it may force a decision neither side can avoid. So here we are. What began as a whisper among wounded veterans has now become a reckoning that no amount of polished speeches or carefully staged appearances can erase. And this is the part that should make everyone pause. Because this story was never really about Prince Harry or Meghan Markle. It was about trust. Trust that was given freely by people who had already given their bodies, their mental health, and in some cases their futures to service. Trust that the Invictus Games would be different. That it would never become just another institution where those at the top were protected while those at the bottom were told to wait, to be patient, to understand. Circle back to the opening question. What if the people Prince Harry once said gave his life meaning are now the ones demanding accountability from him? That's the emotional core of this entire lawsuit. For veterans involved, this isn't about destroying Invictus. Many of them still believe in its original mission. That's what makes this so painful. They didn't walk away quietly. They didn't leak stories for attention. They stepped into the harshest arena possible because they felt every other door had been closed. And the irony is brutal. Invictus means unconquered. Yet these veterans say they felt conquered by silence, by distance, by a system that stopped listening once the cameras stopped rolling. Now, as the 2027 games edge closer, the pressure is undeniable. Every decision made from this point forward will be scrutinized. Every role questioned.